So we're going to talk about the second type of policy or government policy that affects the market for loanable funds. And in this second example, we're going to talk about investment incentives. These incentives could be something like the government instituting an investment tax credit. Typically, these are issued to firms when they are investing in new factories or new types of equipment or machinery and things like that. So this could be just new investment in terms of new factories, equipment, etc. But the idea is to stimulate investment or incentivize investment by giving this investment tax credit. It's like the firm is going to file taxes and it's going to get some kind of a credit back, and it's going to give a tax advantage to any type of firm that is going to build a new factory or a new piece of equipment. So let's try to consider this type of a tax reform on the market for loanable funds. So again, we want to think about the loanable funds market. It's a good idea to always start by drawing your initial equilibrium. In this case, you're going to label your axis. Loanable funds go on the x-axis, and the interest rate, which is the real interest rate, goes on the y-axis. You're going to draw your upward sloping supply curve, which is your national savings curve, and you're going to draw your investment curve, which is your demand curve. Okay, so this is investment, and you're going to label your initial equilibrium. So let's label our initial equilibrium. This guy here, where the demand and supply intersect, is the initial equilibrium. And at this point, the market clears which is to say that the quantity demanded of loanable funds equals the quantity supplied of loanable funds at this point. So savings equals investment at this point. Okay, so our initial equilibrium is LF star. Again, we are writing down the coordinates x comma y, LF star, and R star. And now we're going to think about what happens if there is an investment incentive. So obviously, you know that the first question we ask is, would the policy affect demand or supply? And the answer is that it is going to affect demand, because this is an investment incentive. It should affect investment. And then the second question we want to ask ourselves is, which way would the curve shift? The idea behind an investment incentive or investment tax credit is to stimulate investment or increase investment. So we are going to shift the demand curve or the investment curve to the right, and that is going to reflect an increase in investment. So this guy right here, we can call this D2. This is a rightward shift of the investment curve. And at this point, at this new equilibrium, which is now the intersection of D2 and our old supply curve, we have a new interest rate. Apologies for my not so straight lines, but you get the idea anyway. And we're going to say this is LF1 and this is R1. So our new equilibrium is LF1 and R1. And notice what has happened to our equilibrium interest rate. This has gone up, right? We've gone from R star to R1, and we have also increased after the policy took effect, we have also increased the quantity equilibrium quantity of loanable funds. So R has gone up and loanable funds have gone up. And so this is basically to say that if a tax reform or a law encouraged investment, then the result would be higher interest rates and greater saving. Right now, the interest rate is higher, so that would induce people to save more. So in equilibrium, when we are at LF1, at this point, again, supply and demand are equal, and you notice we are at a much higher point on that supply curve. So saving is going to be a lot more than before. Next, we're going to talk about what happens if there is a government budget deficit. Recall that a budget deficit is defined as the difference between government expenditures and net taxes. So this is the spending, and this is tax revenue, which is really the income of the government. And whenever this guy is positive, that means you're spending more than you are earning in tax revenues. So if a government is running a budget deficit, this could be typically because of two reasons. If the government spends more, this could be on education, it could be to spend on pandemics, it could be for all types of emergency relief or healthcare, etc. The government could spend more, and that could cause a budget deficit, or the government could get less in tax revenues because of different tax policies. So either this or that could happen, or a combination of both could happen, and that would lead to a budget deficit. So let's try to illustrate this point on the graph and try to understand what happens when the government runs a budget deficit. So again, you want to get used to drawing your initial equilibrium in the loanable funds market with interest rate on the y-axis, loanable funds on the x-axis. We're drawing our supply curve, which is upward sloping. The supply of loanable funds comes from national savings. Remember that. And we are drawing our demand curve, which is downward sloping, and that is coming from investment. And the equilibrium is given by the intersection of the demand and supply curves. So again, initial equilibrium is LF star and R star. You can even make this point E, and you can call it E is the point where the demand for loanable funds and the supply for loanable funds are the same, and that's equilibrium or initial equilibrium. And now we want to understand what happens when there is a government budget deficit. When we say budget deficit, it does refer to the government. So sort of irrelevant to say government budget deficit, but anyway, this is going to illustrate the point that now the government is not getting enough in tax revenues or is spending more. So the first question we want to ask ourselves is, would the policy affect demand or supply? And recall that national savings is composed of two things. National savings, it comprises of public and private savings. And so one could think about public savings as the savings of the government. And you know that when the government is running a budget deficit, it is going to save less. So public savings is going to fall, and this is going to decrease national savings. Okay? And so the effect that a budget deficit would cause would be to decrease national savings. And we want to take this idea to the graph. And so what we can do is we can show a leftward shift of the national of the supply curve to reflect a decrease in national savings. So let's do that. And here is a leftward shift. We'll call this S2. And notice at this point, at this new equilibrium, you can call that E1. At this new equilibrium, we have a higher interest rate and a lower quantity of loanable funds. So our interest rate has gone up and loanable funds are lower. So our new equilibrium is LF1 and R1. And what has happened here is that R has gone up and loanable funds have gone down. And this idea that now we have, with the government running a budget deficit, we have lower investment or lower amount of loanable funds, which is going to lead to lower investment. This idea or this concept is called crowding out. So what has happened is that the government has run a budget deficit and now we have lower investment. So crowding out is the idea that there is a fall in investment because of government spending. And so typically, this is to say that when the government runs a budget deficit, or it borrows to finance its deficit, it crowds out private borrowers who are trying to finance investment. And we see this a lot in wartime because at that time governments spend a lot more than they earn in tax revenues. And so the idea here is that, or the bottom line here is that when the government reduces national saving, by running a budget deficit, the interest rate rises and investment falls. And because investment is very important for long-run economic growth, government budget deficits can be detrimental to an economy's growth rate. In other words, government budget deficits can reduce an economy's long-run growth rate.